War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 75, the slim hope for peace in Gaza. So, peace in Gaza is all the news, but it's not really peace, and I think everyone's pretty clear on that. It's a ceasefire. And what is a ceasefire? It's a pause in fighting in a war, where the side getting its butt kicked gets a chance to rearm, refit, and get ready for the next attack. And that's the problem that Israel has, in that they spent 2 years, spent a lot of money, and spent a lot of capital to put them in a position where they can really remove Hamas as a threat. And if Hamas remains in power, especially after being recently rewarded with recognition of statehood from a couple of the Anglospheres and France, then Israel gets nothing, and it's a massive victory for Hamas. And it may seem weird, all the talk of genocide and the destruction and blah, 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 but Hamas will see this as an absolute win. And so this is a little bit of the history of Gaza specific and Hamas, and also some analysis of the charter, the covenant of Hamas. So you understand what exactly they are, because probably like most folks, Hamas is just a thing. It's, kind of like the Cub Scouts or maybe the Veterans of Foreign Wars. It's just another organization. Hamas is a little bit different if you look at it from an Israeli perspective. So first, a little bit of near history on Gaza. In 2005, Israel withdrew unilaterally from the entire Gaza Strip. They had been there since 1967 when they seized it along with the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Now, from 1948 to 1967, Gaza was controlled by Egypt. There was never an independent entity there. Unlike Jordan, which fully absorbed the West Bank after 1948, Egypt kept Gaza in kind of a weird limbo. They owned it, but they wouldn't let the residents move into Egypt proper. They kept them there. And after 1948, there was an influx of Arab refugees out of Israel. And so Gaza was a small population-wise entity that has just continued to grow. What was probably less than 20, 30,000 people in 1948 is now numbered approximately 2 million. So in 2005, Ariel Sharon, then in charge of what was known as Kadima, which was a new political party that Sharon created. Now, Sharon was a heavy hitter within Likud, which is considered the more conservative, more belligerent of the main Israeli parties. And Ariel Sharon was a big part of that. And then he split off and formed Kadima. And his brainchild was, in 2005, he's just going to withdraw from Gaza entirely with no preconditions, no agreements, no peace, nothing. They're just going to leave. And what they got for that, immediately after in 2006, Hezbollah kidnapped some Israeli soldiers to the north, and then there was a large-scale war in Hezbollah in 2006 to mixed results. Israel did not do well initially. They tried to go for an air power-only solution. For the first time in the IDF's history, they had a fighter pilot in charge as the Minister of Defense, and that first phase just did not go well. Ostensibly, they were there to, stop me if you've heard this one before, get back their captured people, the hostages, in this case, prisoners of war. They were uniformed IDF members. And then eventually they went in with ground troops and really hit Hezbollah pretty hard towards the end. But it came away as mixed at best, and many people claiming an Israel defeat. Well, then in 2008, after some rocket attacks from Gaza, Israel went in what was known as Cast Lead. And that was only, 3-week campaign. But tactically and operationally speaking, Israel beat the crap out of Hamas. They learned a lot of the lessons from Hezbollah. Hezbollah had relied heavily on tunnels for decades up until that point. And Hamas had only started its tunnel construction. So they weren't able to hide as well within the civilian infrastructure as Hezbollah was able to in 2006, and then as Hamas has during the most recent fighting. So all that is a lot to say is from 2005, there was no Israeli occupation of Gaza. They were all gone. There were no Jews in Gaza on 7 October until Hamas dragged them back into Gaza. So what is Hamas? Why does it matter? Why is this not just another government within the Western Forum, or even one like, say, Jordan or Egypt or some of the Arab states? Well, Hamas itself is an acronym, I think, of the Arabic, meaning the Islamic Resistance Movement. And so when they were created in 1988, they have a covenant. It's their constitution. If you want to know about Hamas, you can read it. It's not very long. It'll take you maybe 10 minutes to read it. And there are a lot of things in it. It's kind of a redundant document. So I'm going to hit some of the highlights. Now, in its preamble, in the most important part of it, kind of like, we, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, preamble to the Constitution, they have a preamble to the covenant of the Islamic Resistance Movement, sometimes called the Hamas Charter. And it says, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. It's important to understand that Hamas, according to them, is dedicated to the obliteration of Israel. When Hamas talks about occupation, they're not talking about the West Bank. They're not talking about Gaza Strip. They're talking about all of Israel. So when they say, well, you need to come to a negotiated understanding with Hamas, if you are to believe their own charter, their own covenant, there is no negotiation possible with Hamas, which is why Israel from the very outset has been, we want the hostages back and Hamas must cease to exist. So Article 2, the Islamic Resistance Movement, aka Hamas, is one of the wings of the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood is OG, you can say terrorist, a Islamic movement dedicated to the use of violence against civilian targets in the forwarding of their political, and in this case, religious and political are intertwined inexorably. So Al-Qaeda was created from the Muslim Brotherhood. ISIS is part of the Muslim Brotherhood, or if you prefer, the Islamic State or ISIL or whatever you want to call it. It is an Arab nationalist movement dedicated to Arab nationalism, which is kind of ironic in that they want to subdivide the Arab nation into all these Western-defined borders and countries. But Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hamas, they're all the same organization. Now, there's a little bit of irony in that because Iran was the biggest sponsor, still is the biggest sponsor, militarily speaking, for Hamas, despite the fact that Iran is not Arab. It's obviously Persian, or Iranian if you prefer. So when the Muslim Brotherhood took over in Egypt after Mubarak in the elections for a short period of time, Hamas abandoned Iran as its primary sponsor and went to Egypt. And it was during this time when Egypt was controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood that a lot of the arms, munitions, tunnels, all that infrastructure for Hamas was ramped up because the Rafah crossing, which is the crossing point between Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza, was wide open for whatever they wanted. Al-Sisi quickly took over in what can generously be described as a coup and removed the Muslim Brotherhood. But that Rafah crossing has always been a mechanism by which Gaza was able to get these thousands of rockets and weapons and munitions and things like that. So understanding the Muslim Brotherhood and its role in Arab Islamic nationalism is critical to understand Hamas. Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is the founding organization that created Hamas. Of interesting note, the Council for American-Islamic Relations is also part of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood created the Council for American-Islamic Relations. So within Article 8, so you truly appreciate the Islamic resistance movement's baseline. Allah is its target, the Prophet is its model, the Quran its constitution, jihad is its path, and death for the sake of Allah is the loftiest of its wishes. So I think this might be the hardest part for Western audiences to understand about Hamas, is dying in jihad is what they look forward to. It's what they want to do. And this is not a voluntary thing. every Arab is in Hamas's eyes, is automatically drafted, if you will, into this jihad, and that death is the goal. So civilian casualties to Hamas, Arab civilian casualties, mean nothing to them on a personal level. It's simply a means towards jihad, and it's a very effective one, because in Western audiences, they look at the reported body counts, which I don't think are particularly accurate, mostly because there's no verification. Hamas is not shy about showing videos of tragic things. Often they show fake videos of things that they want to be tragic. So I don't believe that 100 Arabs have died every day for the past 2 years in Gaza. I just don't think that's true. But that's what Hamas reports, that's what the UN repeats, and that's what the international press repeats. But assuming it is true, Hamas would not care because, as they say, death for the sake of Allah is the loftiest of its wishes. So going down to Article 13, initiatives and so-called peaceful solutions in international conferences are in contradiction to the principles of the Islamic resistance movement. Abusing any part of Palestine is abuse directed against part of religion. Nationalism is the Islamic resistance movement. Nationalism of the Islamic resistance movement is part of its religion. So we're talking about initiatives, peaceful solutions, conferences, all the things that Hamas is supposed to be taking part in. In its very covenant, it rejects all ideas of a peaceful solution to the problem of the occupation. For them, it's nothing more than a tactic to gain a respite from the fighting that they're currently losing in, and to gain more time so that they can attack again. They explicitly reject any sort of peace treaty. A ceasefire is a tactical pause so that they can regroup and rearm and refit. So, and then right after Article 13, it talks about Article 14. The question of the liberation of Palestine is bound to three circles: the Palestinian circle, the Arab circle, and the Islamic circle. So it expands out. This is not just about Palestinian liberation. It's about Arab nationalism. And then ultimately, it's about Islamic conquest. That is the heart of the Muslim Brotherhood, and Hamas is part of that. So what I find really interesting when I was reading over it, and something I hadn't noticed when I had read it much earlier, is that they talk about Palestine as an Islamic land, which has the first of the two Qiblas. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Islam, the Qibla is the line that is found in every mosque that points the direction to where you're supposed to pray. And there have been in history two primary Qiblas and then kind of an intermediary. The oldest existing mosques, the Qibla points to Petra, which is the ancient holy city in Jordan, that very famously in Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, you see the carved out church in the valley. When you read the descriptions of Mecca within the Quran, they describe not what Mecca looks like, but actually what Petra. So the original Qibla, the original place where all Muslims prayed to at the start of the faith, was towards Petra, which is in Jordan. Then later it changed to Mecca. And during the interim, when I talk about a third intermediary Qibla, there is a Qibla that splits the difference. So in some mosques, they prayed in between Petra and Mecca to kind of split the difference, until eventually Mecca became the unquestioned direction of prayer. So what I find interesting is by accepting the first Qibla that goes towards Petra, they kind of acknowledge that Jordan is actually part of Palestine, which is often an argument made by Zionists, that when they talk about a two-state solution, there already is one. One's Jordan, the other one's Israel. When you look at the history of Jordan, there's never been a historical Jordanian people. Jordan has been a region, much like Lebanon was a region traditionally. So it's just interesting that within the Hamas charter, they explicitly talk about the two Qiblas, and they reference the Petra Qibla, which they say is part of Palestine, which is actually now part of Jordan. So I just found that interesting. It's a really fascinating story about the Qiblas and how they split the difference, and whether Petra was the true holy city that the Quran was referencing. So if you're into that kind of stuff. Also within that article, there's a quote that kind of sums up their governing philosophy. I swear by the holder of Muhammad's soul that I would like to invade and be killed for the sake of Allah, then invade and be killed, and then invade again and be killed. So invasion and dying is the ultimate goal for Hamas and its members. So when we talk about a ceasefire versus a peace treaty and Hamas retaining not only military power but diplomatic power, when they're dedicated to invasion and death, it's hard for Israel to accept that, which is why ultimately I'm not very optimistic about any sort of peace treaty actually coming to fruition. And so also within the covenant, they talk about some kind of iffy history. So here's one. We should not forget to remind every Muslim that when the Jews conquered the holy city in 1967, they stood on the threshold of the Aqsa Mosque, which is where the Western Wall is in the old city of Jerusalem, and they proclaimed that Muhammad is dead and his descendants are all women. Now, I don't know where they got this from. Maybe they've got a video recording of it. I think it's just made up. But this is their covenant. They do not think that any peace is possible with the Jews, that Israel's very existence itself is not only an affront upon Palestinian nationalism, but is an affront to Islam itself. This is not merely political nationalism, that this is a religious desire to destroy Israel, which, because it is religion, it makes it a lot harder to negotiate out in good faith, because you can't ask good faith negotiations, which they reject earlier in their covenant, when the faith in their own religion has got to have primacy. It is a religious duty upon Hamas to destroy Israel. You're asking them to abandon their very faith in pursuit of peace. I just don't think that's going to happen. And even if it could happen, even if that is not true, I think the Israelis believe it. So they have no motivation to accept a ceasefire with Hamas or any sort of deal that allows them to retain combat power and political power. So, going on, they go into the protocols of the Elders of Zion. The Zionist plan is limitless. The Zionists aspire to expand from the Nile to the Euphrates. Then they want further expansion and so on, basically saying the Zionists want to take over the world, and it is incumbent upon all Arabs and Muslims to stop them. And then this goes into some of the internal politics. Leaving the circle of struggle with Zionism is high treason, and cursed be that who does it. So if anyone doesn't agree with Hamas and their struggle with Zionism, that's high treason and can be and is punishable by death. And people have been executed by Hamas. That's an unquestioned fact. What is questionable is how many. But the videos of torture and executions by Hamas on Arabs within Gaza, they're out there. So Hamas doesn't leave a choice to the population of Gaza whether or not they get to fight Israel. As long as Hamas is in power, you will fight Israel. And if you don't, that's high treason and is punishable by death. Now, this is kind of funny. One of the last articles, the last thing I'll talk about within their charter is, while paving its way, the Islamic Revolution movement emphasizes time and again to all the sons of our people, to the Arab and Islamic nations, that it does not seek personal fame, material gain, or social prominence. That being said, Ismail Haniyeh, Musa Abu Marzouk, and Khalid Mashal each are worth $3 to $4 billion, and they all live in Qatar. So just those three individuals are good for a combined $10 to $12 billion of personal net worth. So while material gain may not be the goal, they certainly have attained it. So there is a very personal, very materialistic desire for them to not stop what's going on. Because if a lasting peace were to be found between the Arabs and the Jews in the region, the money dries up. No more UNRWA, no more pumping in, billions of dollars from the UN. Only when they can claim war and strife and occupation can they demand and receive the billions of dollars that they get. That goes to the senior leadership who doesn't live in Gaza. The senior leadership of Hamas lives in Qatar, and who pays a lot of their bills. And it's not just those three who are multi-billionaires, but apparently, and by the way, that information is from the U.S. Treasury. Hundreds of Hamas leaders are all millionaires. So back to the original point, a ceasefire is not peace. A ceasefire is just a chance for Hamas to refit so it can attack again. What Israel has to debate is how many Jews in the future will have to die for a ceasefire now. And Netanyahu has been the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history. He has served more time in that role than any other, far exceeding Ben Gurion at this point. The Israelis seem comfortable with him in charge as long as the war is going on. But once the war is over, Netanyahu's out, and he knows it. And so he has nothing to lose politically by continuing the war because he'll stay in power. But also, for him, I think it's also a point of he wants to leave with a lasting legacy of having established the hardest and most difficult peace, that within the Palestinian Arabs themselves. Israel's made peace with Egypt. Israel has made peace with Jordan. They've made peace with several of the Arab countries. Peace might be back on the table with Lebanon and Syria due to the political changes there, yet to be seen. Many people have stated that Israel and Saudi Arabia were close to a peace treaty in 2023, and the entire point of the 7 October attack was to break up that peace negotiation between Saudi Arabia and Israel, what's known as the Abraham Accords, which went through anyways. Now, it was delayed quite a bit, and the crown prince who runs Saudi Arabia and said, look, that's not our issue. So, it's not that Hamas are a bunch of religious zealots who are not capable of thinking about political gain and geopolitics and being aware of that. They are. But the question becomes, and there's no clear answer, whether Hamas uses Islam as a means for political gain or whether Hamas uses politics as a mechanism to forge jihad and their true faith in Islam. Arguments can be made either way, but you're asking Israel to assume that their charter is a lie, that their covenant is a lie, that what they say is a lie, when all their actions seem to support it, aside from becoming billionaires, and who can blame them? So that's really the tough part. Is Netanyahu going to abandon all the political, military, economic capital that is expended to put Hamas really in a position where it can be defeated militarily? Hamas is on the ropes. They're desperate for a peace treaty. And for them, if they survive in any mechanism, it's a massive victory for them. And I don't think Netanyahu, and I don't think Israel as a whole, I don't think the Israeli people want to give Hamas any victory, because then it just rewards October 7th. And it guarantees another attack like that at some point. There's no peace possible if Hamas survives with political power and retaining military power. And Hamas is already demanding that it retains military power, which it claims for self-defense. But if that was true, then they could have just had Gaza. And they don't need to defend Gaza. The only reason the IDF is in Gaza is because Hamas attacked them. Israel had all of Gaza, and they gave it back without preconditions. And now they realize what a fool's errand that was and what it cost them. So this understanding where Hamas really comes from and what they truly believe is the failure, I think, of the post-World War II era is the projection of Western values onto non-Western entities. Certainly happened in Afghanistan, Iraq, I think the PLO. We like to pretend that the values that Western cultures pretty much universally share is shared by everyone, and they're not. When Hamas says death for the sake of Allah is its loftiest goal, a lot of people believe it. Does it mean the leadership in Qatar means it, or Qatar? I don't know. But a lot of people do. Enough people do that Israel has to take that threat realistically. They don't have the luxury to project Western values onto their immediate neighbors. It's a luxury for Europe. It's a luxury for the United States because they're not our immediate neighbors. So you do have to have a little bit of perspective from Israel's side in order to understand why this is such a difficult negotiating point for them to retain Hamas in power. And, on the other side, Hamas could have stopped this war by, one, not invading on 7 October, or on 8 October, they could have returned all the hostages and surrendered, and there never would have been a war there, and there never would have been any Arabs' deaths. But that's not what Hamas cares about. Hamas does not care if Arabs die. quite frankly. They take deliberate action so more Arabs die because they see that as one, a religious objective, and two, a very politically useful tool. Hamas does everything it can to ensure that civilian casualties are as high as possible, or at least reported as high as possible. That's why they don't release how many of the dead in Gaza were fighters. They don't differentiate. They were all women and children. That's how they release it, and that's how it's reported through the UN. So it's a very difficult problem. So this goes into the greater point of war termination theory. And this is a very Western thing. You have realism with it, it's just power politics, very Clausewitz's war is the continuation of policy by other means, juice worth the squeeze. Does this war benefit us in whatever means, material and whatnot? Then you have the internal factors, which realism is external. You could say internal factors, the liberalism, where you look at political ideology. You could look at, say, the Falklands and the junta looking at war as a motivation internally. And I think this might lean a little bit the heaviest on Hamas, that jihad against Israel, or the Tartar Zionist Nazi regime, as they refer to it, for them, it's an internal thing. They are in conflict with the PLO, Fatah, for who is the legitimate ruler of the Palestinian Arabs. And the more Jews they kill, the more legitimacy they gain in the eyes of the Arab world. So you could look at it that way. And then there's the psychological factors, which are a country's individual leaders. So you could look at that with Hitler. You could look at that, you might argue, with Japan, that individuals in power will drive war. Now, many have argued that this war is entirely of the creation of Netanyahu, that there'd be no war without him. I don't know if that's true. I do believe that Israel is not only a democracy, but hyper-democracy. The Israeli people don't want Netanyahu as prime minister anymore, but they want for him to finish the war first, and then they'll kick him out. Netanyahu knows this. The Israeli people know this. Likud, the party which Netanyahu is a part of, knows this. So I don't think the psychological aspect of the power dynamics of Netanyahu is true, because I don't think it works in a democracy, especially one that can have a recall election, which Israel could do. At any point, the ruling coalition of Israel could have broken apart, and there would have been new elections if they didn't like what Netanyahu was doing. So those are considered the three major schools of thought: external, internal, and then individual psychology, and the megalomaniac, Napoleon, for example. And then ultimately, war serves as a means for two parties who have mutually exclusive objectives to determine the relative power of each, and then from that determine what they can possibly extract. And war is the test. You don't really know how strong you are vis-a-vis your enemy until you actually fight them. Saddam Hussein in 1991 with his defense of Kuwait strategy, where he would attrit American and Western European forces to such a degree that they would beg for peace because the Westerners couldn't accept high casualties. Well, we had a test, and Saddam Hussein was wrong. Then we could say there was a test between the United States, NATO, but primarily the United States, and the Taliban, where the power of their motivation to defend their homeland was stronger than we gave them credit for. We inflicted horrific casualties upon them, but ultimately the Taliban had gained their objective, and we lost because the power of the moral to the physical was, in the case of Afghanistan, maybe even greater to 3-1. We underestimated their power, and we paid with a 20-year lost campaign against an incredibly weak enemy. So the theory of war termination states that conflict will continue until both sides understand their relative strengths. So bring this back to Hamas. At the beginning of the war, Hamas had its rocket arsenal. It had Hezbollah, it had Iran, Syria, the Houthis to all aid them militarily, and then the Qatari monarchy, and not the monarchies of some of the other Gulf Arab states, but certainly some of the monarchs within them. There's like thousands of princes in Saudi Arabia who provided support. And the Qatari monarchy would provide financial support and could use its informational advantage with Al Jazeera to sway Western audiences. And Qatar has been a huge ally of Hamas during this whole fighting. And of course, having killed a lot of Jews, there would be broad support among the Islamic world. But after 2 years, a lot of those assumed sources of power for Hamas are gone, if not at least severely weakened. Iran has been slapped around, one, militarily, and two, they're having huge issues diplomatically, economically. They've got a water crisis going on. Obviously, Hezbollah was literally neutered by various means, most famously by the beeper attack by Israel. I can't say all, but I'd say 99% of all the rockets are gone that Hamas had. They fired them all. What was a huge issue at the beginning of the war, they're no longer an issue. Hamas has lost that. The Houthis are still doing their thing, but they're by far the weakest. And of course, the Assad regime in Syria is gone. It's been replaced, ironically, with another Muslim Brotherhood offshoot. But because Hamas has been so closely tied to Iran, while its charter is explicitly Muslim Brotherhood, their alliances are quite frayed with actual other Muslim Brotherhood organizations. So Syria, while in theory an ally, they're not an ally with Hezbollah. And Syria's real alliance was the resupply of Hezbollah, Iran through Syria to Lebanon, supplying. That was the real source of Syria's strength. Syria is certainly not aligned or allied with Iran or Hezbollah anymore. So that's kind of gone. And so you hear, and it's very accurate, that the hostages are the last remaining leverage Hamas has against Israel. And it's absolutely true. In the absence of the hostages, what does Hamas have? It's got nothing. And so are they going to give up all the hostages? I don't know. We'll see. I'm not optimistic. And if they do, they'll give up the live ones. They'll keep the bodies because Israel very much wants the remaining dead hostages as well. Hamas will claim that, we don't know where they are. We lost them, whatever. I don't think that's true. Those things are too valuable for Hamas to just lose them. But they're going to maintain whatever levers they can, and they don't have much more remaining other than Qatar support and the bodies of their hostages and the live ones. As of this, all the actual hostages have not been released yet. I don't know if they will or not. So overall, this is not a conflict between the Arabs in Gaza against Israel. It's Israel versus Hamas. And the objective of Israel has not changed. I want the hostages back, and I want Hamas removed. Everything else has been a continuation of that, and obviously Hamas does not want to be removed. Much as Hamas wants Israel destroyed, and Israel doesn't want to be destroyed, Israel wants Hamas destroyed, and Hamas does not want to be destroyed. And yes, they are willing to sacrifice as many Arabs as possible in Gaza in order to maintain power, which puts you in a really bad place. So what does all this mean? Well, there's no real peace possible with Hamas, which is why peace is not on the table. It's a ceasefire. And so we're just saying, how many more dead in the future is Israel willing to accept for a ceasefire that retains Hamas in power? So to reiterate and to finalize, having already suffered the sunk cost of 2 years of war and endless international condemnation, with seemingly little directed against Hamas, Israel would be foolish to acquiesce to a ceasefire which allows Hamas to remain in power. Everything in the past 2 years would have been a waste. This war could have never started, but that's not Hamas. Hamas could have surrendered quickly, but that is not jihad. So I'm not optimistic, even for a ceasefire to take place, because Israel is the only one who really has a vested interest in taking Hamas at its word. Everyone else just wants peace. They want it to get off the news. But for Israel, it's a real question of future attacks like October 7th. I just don't think they're willing to accept it. So we'll see. I hope I'm wrong. I really hope something comes out of this good. I just don't see it happening. I don't think Hamas is willing to accept that. And I don't think they've been crushed enough that they become a non-entity. But we'll see. So I'll catch you later.
Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.